Thanksgiving dinner. My arm was broken and I couldn't even hold a fork. My daughter said, "My husband taught him a lesson." He laughed. The old woman thought she was the boss. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang and his face turned pale. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to her voice and tell me in the comments which part shocked you the most. Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to feel warm. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, the candles flickered, and soft music played in the background. But I sat there with a broken arm, my right hand wrapped in a stiff cast that made it impossible to even hold a fork. Every movement sent a small ache up my shoulder, but the real pain wasn't in my arm. It was in the silence. No one spoke. No one dared to meet my eyes. The table was long and heavy, filled with dishes I couldn't touch. Mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, the kind of food that used to mean love. But that night, it all just looked like a quiet reminder that love can turn cruel. Emily sat across from me, her face pale and distant, pretending to focus on the turkey she was cutting. She couldn't look at me. I could tell she wanted to. Her hands trembled just a little when she reached for the gravy boat. Mark noticed it. He always noticed everything. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into that smug grin I once thought was confidence, but now knew was something darker. Then he said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. The old woman thought she was the boss. His laugh cut through the quiet like a knife scraping a plate. Emily froze, her eyes filling with something I couldn't name. Shame, fear, maybe both. My chest tightened. I didn't say a word. I just kept staring at my plate, pretending to study the gravy stains on the edge. My cast rested heavy in my lap, wrapped in white cloth like some kind of punishment. Mark picked up his glass of wine, swirling it slowly. "My husband taught him a lesson," Emily muttered under her breath, her voice barely holding together. She said it like she was reading lines from a script she hated. The room went completely still. The guests, distant cousins, neighbors, stopped chewing. Forks hovered in midair. The only sound left was the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. I wanted to stand up and leave, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. I could feel Mark's eyes on me, waiting for me to react. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I sat still, breathing through the ache, holding my dignity like a fragile bird in my chest. The shame in that room was thick enough to taste. It tasted like cold metal. Then, out of nowhere, the doorbell rang. Once, then again. Sharp and insistent. Mark frowned, annoyed. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered, pushing his chair back. I didn't move. Something inside me told me to stay quiet, to just watch. When he opened the door, I saw the color drain from his face. His voice, once loud and full of arrogance, cracked slightly. "Oh, officer." He stepped aside. No one spoke. Not even Emily. I just sat there, feeling the smallest spark of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Quiet, trembling, and alive. The night before Thanksgiving still plays in my mind like a film I never asked to see. It was late, maybe close to midnight. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the doorway. I had stayed up to finish a pie, something I'd always done for Emily since she was little. She used to sneak bites of the filling, giggling with sugar on her lips. But now she was married, and her laughter lived in another house, a house I never truly felt welcome in. Mark had come home late, smelling of whiskey and expensive cologne, the kind of smell that clings to anger. His voice was sharp when he called my name, not Mom or Mrs. Carter, just Helen, like a warning. I remember drying my hands on a towel and turning around slowly. "You forgot to turn off the porch light," he said, his words slurring slightly. I told him I had left it on for Emily, since she hadn't come home yet. That was enough to light his temper. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, the kind of look that makes you shrink even before he says a word. I'd seen that look before. On my husband years ago, before he learned to quiet the storms inside him. But Mark wasn't the kind of man who wanted peace. He wanted control. He started shouting about how I didn't respect boundaries, how it wasn't my home anymore. I told him calmly that the house was still in my name, that I only wanted to make the holiday special for all of us. The next few seconds blurred. I remember his hand waving in the air, a shove against my shoulder, the hard edge of the counter meeting my arm, and then the sound. That awful crack. The pain was immediate, white and searing. I remember falling to the floor, clutching my arm, gasping for air. Emily rushed in, her eyes wide with panic, but she froze when he turned toward her. She didn't move. She didn't call for help. She just whispered, "Mark, please," like a child begging a storm to stop. When she finally helped me up, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely lift me. He said it was an accident, that I tripped, that I should be more careful. I could see it in his eyes. He was daring me to argue. But I didn't. Not that night. I went to bed with tears soaking my pillow, listening to the sound of their muffled voices through the wall. I wanted Emily to come check on me. She didn't. By morning, the swelling had turned my arm purple, and the shame had turned my heart cold. I wrapped my arm in a scarf and said I'd slipped on the porch steps. Emily nodded, pretending to believe me. But the truth hung between us like smoke. That night taught me that silence isn't peace. It's surrender, and I realized I had surrendered too many times already. The morning after Thanksgiving, I sat in my living room, the quiet pressing down like a heavy blanket. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and turkey, but underneath that sweetness was something bitter, the memory of last night. My arm throbbed with every heartbeat, the bruises blooming across my skin like dark petals. I kept staring at them, tracing their shapes as if they could tell me how long this kind of pain had been waiting to surface. The bruises weren't just on my skin. They were inside me. Small, hidden ones that had been growing for years each time I bit my tongue, each time I chose silence over confrontation. Outside, I heard Nancy's old car pull into the driveway. She didn't even knock. She never did. She just walked in with that gentle firmness of someone who's seen too much and still cares enough to show up. "I saw your light on," she said, placing a small pie on the counter. She looked at my arm, her eyes narrowing. "That doesn't look like a fall, Helen." I smiled weakly, trying to deflect with some excuse about tripping on the porch, but Nancy wasn't one to believe easy lies. She sat across from me, her hands folded, her voice low and certain. "You can't let this go." Her words sank deep, unsettling the quiet part of me that had been sleeping for years. I wanted to tell her everything about Mark, about the way Emily looked away, about the silence that had taken root in my own home. But the words wouldn't come. They sat in my throat like stones. Instead, I said, "It's family, Nancy. You don't turn against your own." She shook her head slowly. "Sometimes not turning away means losing yourself." After she left, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the leaves drift down the street. I thought about all the small ways control sneaks into a life. It starts with decisions. What brand of coffee to buy, what channel to watch, when to speak. Then one day, you wake up and realize none of those choices are yours anymore. You're just living around someone else's temper, trying not to make the wrong sound. I glanced at the clock, noticing how every minute stretched out longer than it should. My home, the one I'd built with love and laughter, suddenly felt like a stranger's house. I used to decorate that table with flowers every Sunday. I used to open the curtains wide to let the sun in. Now I kept them half closed. Fear does that. It dims everything you love, one shade at a time. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection. The bruises stared back, deep purple, almost black. But under them, I saw something else. A spark, small, faint, but alive. Nancy's words echoed in my head. "You can't let this go." And for the first time in a long time, I whispered to myself, "Maybe I won't." The quiet in the house stretched thin that evening, almost brittle. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my casted arm resting on the edge, staring at the untouched turkey from dinner. My mind kept replaying Mark's laughter, the way he'd leaned back in his chair, smug and untouchable. Emily had avoided my eyes the entire meal, whispering excuses like rehearsed lines, and I could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on me. The world outside moved on, but inside that house, time had folded into a heavy, tense pause. Then the doorbell rang. Sharp, insistent. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was late, the shadows stretching across the hallway, and the sound echoed, louder than it should. Mark's face twisted into annoyance. "Who could that be at this hour?" he muttered. He stomped toward the door, his boots heavy on the floor, leaving me staring at the table, my fingers lightly brushing the worn edge. My arm throbbed, but I hardly noticed. Something told me to stay quiet, to wait, to watch. Mark opened the door with that arrogant grin, the one he thought could charm any situation. But it faltered almost immediately. His eyes widened, his posture stiffened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Behind him, I heard the calm, measured voice of Deputy Reed. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His tone wasn't accusatory, not loud, but there was a quiet authority in it. I could feel it all the way to my chest. Mark's jaw tightened. Yes, officer?" His smile was gone, replaced by a faint tremor. I sat back in my chair, feeling the slow shift of power in the room. Emily didn't move, didn't speak. She just clutched the edge of her napkin, eyes wide, watching her husband unravel without anyone needing to say a word. The deputy asked a few calm, precise questions about my well-being, about the dinner, about injuries he'd apparently heard of from a neighbor. I felt a strange, steady strength settle over me as I answered simply and truthfully. No theatrics, no emotion, just words. Clear, careful, undeniable. Mark's face went pale with every sentence. He opened his mouth, probably to argue, but the calm, watchful eyes of Deputy Reed held him back. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. Silence had become my shield. Emily, still frozen, finally exhaled, and I saw something like relief cross her face. The deputy gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that carried more support than words could ever hold. When the officer left, closing the door behind him, the atmosphere felt changed. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and Mark slumped into a chair, defeated in a way that no words or shouting could convey. Emily finally moved closer, her hand brushing mine. No one needed to speak. The room hummed with quiet understanding, and for the first time in weeks, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the balance of control was beginning to shift. The doorbell had rung, and with it, something inside me had awakened. After the door closed, the house felt heavier, but in a different way, less suffocating, more tense, like the air itself was waiting. I stayed at the table for a long moment, letting the quiet settle, noticing the bruises on my arm, the faint ache in my shoulder, the trembling that didn't go away even when the room seemed still. Emily hovered near the counter, her eyes darting toward me, toward Mark, trying to figure out where she belonged in the silence. I didn't move. I just breathed, slow and deliberate, letting the memory of Deputy Reed's calm authority fill me with a strange reassurance. It was mid-morning when he returned. Not as a visit exactly, but with a few forms, a clipboard, and that soft but unshakable presence that makes you believe the world can still be fair. He asked questions I had answered the night before, but this time it felt different. The words were gentle, yet precise, almost surgical. "Are you safe now?" he asked. Not in the way someone asks to be polite, but in a way that carries attention, concern, and expectation. I nodded slowly, careful to keep my voice even. "Yes," I said. "I'm fine." Even as I said it, I could feel my heart hammering against the cage of my ribs. Mark hovered behind me, shifting his weight like a man trying to regain balance on a slippery floor. I could see the beads of sweat forming at his hairline, his grin never quite returning. Emily fumbled with her words, trying to explain away last night, her lips pressed tight, her voice cracking just enough to betray her guilt. I stayed calm. I let them speak, letting the truth rise quietly, like a slow tide that cannot be stopped. Deputy Reed glanced at me once, a slight nod, a soft acknowledgement that I understood without words. He asked about the house, about the incident, and I answered simply, without dramatics. He didn't rush me, didn't push me, he simply listened. That in itself felt like a miracle. When he finally stepped back, papers in hand, he gave Mark a polite but firm warning, and then he turned to me with a faint, reassuring smile. The message was clear. The house was mine, the law had noticed, and I didn't need to fight alone. After he left, the house felt different. The air was lighter, but the tension between us, Mark, Emily, and me, lingered like a stubborn fog. Mark slumped into the chair at the head of the table, defeated in a quiet, suffocating way. He tried to make a joke, something about family, about lessons, but it fell flat. I didn't laugh. I didn't need to. Silence was my answer. Emily's shoulders sagged, relief and fear mingling, but she didn't speak either. She didn't need to. I realized then, for the first time in months, that the world didn't have to be as heavy as it felt. That help could arrive quietly without noise or drama, and that the scales could tip in your favor without shouting. I could feel the first tiny seeds of strength begin to grow in me, small and fragile, but alive. Something had shifted, and it wasn't Mark's control anymore. For the first time, I understood what quiet power felt like, and that realization carried a strange, comforting warmth all the way down to my bruised arm. Once the last car had disappeared down the street, leaving only the soft hum of distant traffic, the house felt heavy with a quiet I hadn't noticed before. The echoes of laughter, forced smiles, and Mark's biting words still lingered, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. I sank into my favorite chair, the one by the window that framed the little garden I had tended for decades. My arm throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing on my chest, the betrayal, the silence, the way Emily had turned inward, trying to shield herself while letting the cruelty of her husband slide over me. Mark, of course, didn't care. He moved about the kitchen with that air of arrogance that once made my stomach tighten in irritation and now made it settle into something colder. A growing, steady fire of awareness. He made sarcastic comments about the dishes, about the turkey, about me, like he always did. Emily wiped tears in secret, leaving streaks across her cheeks as she quietly gathered plates. I didn't say a word. I only watched, letting the sound of their movements fill the quiet spaces in the room. It was in that silence that I made my decision. For years I had let them take the lead, my house, my meals, my peace, all surrendered to keep some fragile notion of family harmony alive. But no more. That night, I promised myself something I hadn't dared in decades, I would never be powerless in my own home again. Not with Mark, not with Emily, not with anyone. I stood and slowly made my way to the window, noticing the way the shadows of the bare trees stretched across the lawn. Every detail, every small imperfection, suddenly seemed important. The chipped paint on the porch steps, the bird feeder swaying in the cold breeze, the faint smell of rosemary from the garden bed below. I breathed it all in, letting the mundane beauty of it remind me that this was my life, my space, my home. Later, as I washed the remaining dishes with my good hand, I let my thoughts wander. I thought of Nancy, her quiet strength, the way she had always insisted that I could stand up for myself. I thought of the deputy and the subtle reassurance in his tone, the way he had looked at me as though my words alone carried weight. I realized that strength doesn't always come from shouting. It comes from clarity, from quiet patience, from understanding exactly who you are and what belongs to you. By the time I went to bed, the aches in my arm were dulled by the satisfaction that my mind was sharpening in ways it hadn't before. I could feel the beginnings of a plan, delicate and slow, forming like a careful blueprint. This wasn't about anger or revenge in the way Mark understood it. It was about reclaiming what was always mine: dignity, peace, and control of the life I had built. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to sleep without trembling, feeling that strange, comforting mix of fear and hope, the kind that tells you something is about to change. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I found it, tucked behind a stack of old photo albums in the study, a worn manila folder that had gone unnoticed for years. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out, my casted arm brushing against the edge of the desk, and a familiar scent of aged paper and old ink drifted up. Inside were property documents, deeds, and bank statements, the proof of something I had known, vaguely in my heart, but never fully embraced. The house, the land, the small savings tucked away for rainy days, it was all in my name. Every brick, every tree in the yard, every tiny corner of this home belonged to me. I sat on the floor, leaning back against the desk, feeling the weight of it all settle around me. My arm throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the surge of clarity that rushed through me. For months, I had felt like a guest in my own home, like an intruder, silenced by Mark's arrogance and Emily's quiet hesitation. And now, for the first time, I realized I had the power to take it back, not through yelling, not through confrontation, but quietly, gracefully, with the law and my own patience as allies. I flipped through the documents slowly, savoring every word. The deeds were clear, the signatures of my late husband, the notarized papers, the bank account statements, everything was mine. My pulse quickened, but not with fear, with anticipation. The bruises on my arm felt smaller, insignificant in comparison to the authority I had carried all along without fully recognizing it. My mind wandered to Nancy, who had always said, "Strength comes quietly." I could hear her voice in my head now. "You can't let this go, Helen. Not like this. Not ever." I tucked the folder under my arm and carried it to the living room, where the sunlight spilled across the worn carpet. I sat down, letting the light warm my face, and began imagining what I could do. I didn't need to confront Mark with rage or accusation. That would only make him defensive, proud, and reckless. What I needed was subtlety, patience, the kind of quiet preparation that comes from knowing exactly what belongs to you. I thought about the holidays still to come, the dinners, the small moments where control had always been wrested from me, and I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips. I would participate, I would be present, but this time I would hold my own. The papers in that folder were more than ink and signatures. They were permission, permission to reclaim my life, my peace, my dignity. Later that afternoon, Emily came by, her face carrying the familiar blend of worry and guilt. I offered her tea, smiling gently, and she hesitated, sensing something had shifted in me. I didn't speak of the folder, not yet. Some truths, I realized, carry their own quiet power when left for the right moment. I only poured the tea and watched the steam rise, thinking of the careful steps I would take, of the calm, inevitable reclamation that had begun. For the first time in months, I felt in control. Not like a shout in a crowded room, but like a steady pulse, slow and certain, beneath the surface. And that, I realized, was the beginning of something beautiful. After discovering the folder, a strange calm settled over me, one that I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I had allowed Mark's arrogance and Emily's hesitations to dictate the rhythm of my life, to push me into corners where I felt invisible. But now, armed with the knowledge that the house, the savings, the very foundation of my life belonged to me, I felt a quiet, simmering clarity. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. I just needed patience and precision, the kind that whispers rather than screams. Nancy visited that afternoon, carrying her usual basket of freshly baked bread and a knowing smile. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She just sat in the living room, rocking slightly in her chair, and said, "You know what has to be done." Her words were soft, yet they struck me with the force of truth. I nodded slowly, my fingers tracing the edge of the folder I had moved to the coffee table. We talked in hushed tones about lawyers, documents, the subtle steps that would let me reclaim my home without unnecessary drama. I felt a thrill in the quiet planning, a gentle, almost secretive excitement. I spent the rest of the day moving carefully through the house, noticing details I had ignored for too long. The creak of the floorboards, the slight sag of the porch steps, the small scratches on the dining table that had accumulated over decades, all reminders that this space belonged to me, that my life had been layered into every corner, every shadow. I even prepared the guest room, arranging it neatly as if I were expecting someone important. I knew I wasn't. The arrangement was for me, a demonstration of my own control, a quiet assertion that I could still command the space I had built. I also began keeping a careful eye on Mark and Emily, attending dinners with the same politeness I always had, smiling while internally noting every movement, every word. I asked no questions, revealed nothing, and let them underestimate me completely. That was the beauty of a quiet plan. It grows in silence, invisible, unstoppable. The thought of the eventual shift, when control would quietly come back to me, brought a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. I didn't need it. The satisfaction would come in stillness, in the subtle unveiling of truth. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I watched the moonlight fall across the garden. The shadows seemed softer, the house lighter. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a Thanksgiving that felt peaceful again, where I could hold my fork, set my own table, and breathe without fear. The quiet plan had begun, invisible but potent, winding its way through the edges of my days, and as I sipped my tea, I whispered to myself, barely audible, "This time, it will be my house, my life, my peace." The words felt sacred, a vow I intended to keep with calm, steady certainty. It took a few days, but finally I made the call. Tom Riley, a lawyer Nancy had recommended years ago but I'd never needed until now, answered with calm efficiency. There was no judgment in his voice, no rush, only the quiet certainty of someone who understood that small, careful actions can change everything. I explained the situation simply, without dramatics, letting the words settle between us. Tom listened, asked a few precise questions, and then quietly outlined the steps we would take. Nothing rushed, nothing loud, just methodical, deliberate progress. A week later, I found myself in his office, my bruised arm still wrapped, a small handbag resting against my knee. The smell of polished wood and old books filled the room. Tom placed a folder in front of me. Inside were documents to update the deeds, transfer savings, and legally confirm the home was solely mine. My heart thumped, slow and steady, in a rhythm that matched the careful steps I had taken to get here. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight, feeling the gravity of the moment. For so long, control had been something I only pretended to have. Now the ink would make it real. Mark had no idea. Emily still didn't know. And that was exactly how I wanted it. There was power in patience, in letting the people who underestimated you continue to believe they held it. I signed each paper deliberately, my hand trembling slightly not from fear, but from the intensity of reclaiming what had been mine all along. The documents carried more than legal authority. They carried validation, dignity, and a quiet, undeniable triumph. As Tom explained each clause, I realized how subtle justice can be. No yelling, no confrontation, no dramatic scene. Just clarity, patience, and the law on your side. The bruises on my arm, the shame I had felt at the Thanksgiving table, the whispered lessons from Nancy. All of it coalesced into this small, quiet victory. I didn't feel the need to gloat, to rub it in, to make anyone pay. The act of signing, of asserting my rightful ownership, was enough. When I left Tom's office, the sunlight spilling across the Charleston streets felt different, lighter, softer. I walked slowly, savoring the warmth on my face, the knowledge that the small, careful steps I had taken were irreversible. This was my house, my savings, my life. The invisible chains that had held me back were loosening, one deliberate movement at a time. That evening, I set the table in the dining room, my arm still stiff, but my spirit stronger than it had been in months. I poured myself a small glass of wine and lifted it gently, a quiet toast to patience, to dignity, to slow victories that speak louder than anger ever could. For the first time I felt that strange, steady satisfaction of knowing the power was finally mine, and that it would stay that way, wrapped not in noise, but in calm, unwavering certainty. Weeks passed, and slowly, I began to reclaim the rhythms of my life. I stopped joining Mark and Emily at every meal, stopped letting their presence dictate my movements in the house. The dining room, once a stage for tension and silent battles, now felt lighter. I still set the table sometimes, for myself or for Nancy when she stopped by, placing the dishes carefully, arranging the silverware just so. The act of preparation, once dominated by anxiety and expectation, became a ritual of calm control. Mark noticed, of course. His voice grew sharper, his words edged with irritation. "Why are you eating alone again?" he asked one evening, leaning against the doorway with that familiar smirk. I didn't respond immediately. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that I no longer needed his approval. Emily hovered, hesitant, torn between loyalty to her husband and the growing realization of what her mother had quietly begun. Her eyes met mine, pleading silently, but I only offered a small, steady smile. No words were necessary. I found solace in the simple routines that had once brought me joy. The garden became my sanctuary again, pruning the roses, planting herbs, tending to the little patch of earth that had always been mine. The smell of soil, the rough texture of leaves against my fingers, the sunlight warming my back. Each small act reminded me that control, when quiet and deliberate, could feel as gentle as it was powerful. I even returned to volunteering at the local community center, helping with meal preparations for families who, like me, needed steadiness and care. Every time I chopped vegetables or arranged chairs, I felt my confidence grow, imperceptibly but surely. The empty chair at the head of the dining table became symbolic. It wasn't about absence or punishment, it was about space, about claiming the right to exist on my own terms. I didn't need Mark to approve. I didn't need Emily to defend me. I only needed myself, and for the first time in months, I felt a quiet, unshakable peace settle in my chest. Sometimes Mark tried to provoke, his sarcasm slipping into subtle digs. But I had learned patience. I responded only when necessary, my voice calm, measured, and firm. The power in my restraint was more potent than any shout, more effective than any argument. He began to realize slowly that I was no longer the woman who bent to his temper. My presence alone, steady and composed, became a quiet assertion of authority in my own home. That Thanksgiving, though empty of dramatic confrontation, marked a turning point. The house, once a place of tension and fear, began to feel like mine again. The small victories, the quiet assertions, the slow, deliberate reclaiming of space, all of it added up. I realized that sometimes the most profound strength isn't loud or forceful. It's calm. It's measured. It's the ability to stand firm, even when no one else notices, and to know that the next move, when it comes, will be entirely yours. It was a Tuesday morning when the mail arrived unusually early. Slipping through the slot with a soft clatter, I carried it to the kitchen, my casted arm still stiff but manageable, and sorted through the usual bills and flyers. Then among them, I found a plain envelope with my name written in careful, formal handwriting. There was no return address. My heart gave a little flutter, part curiosity, part unease. Something about the envelope felt deliberate, significant, as if the universe had handed me a small key to a locked door I didn't yet know existed. I sat at the counter, my fingers brushing over the smooth paper before carefully opening it. Inside was a letter from the law firm handling the estate of my late husband. Documents I hadn't expected to see, matters that had remained hidden until now. The words were precise, polite, yet carried weight. There were adjustments to the accounts, certain assets that had been overlooked, and clarifications that gave me even more undisputed control over my home and finances. My pulse quickened, but it wasn't fear. It was satisfaction, a deep, quiet joy that seeped into my bones. I felt the past months of tension, pain, and betrayal crystallize into something tangible. Power reclaimed. Mark came into the kitchen just as I was reading, unaware of the significance of the envelope in my hand. "Morning," he said, half smile, half smirk, expecting the usual polite responses. I looked at him calmly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him. He raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing that something had changed, though he couldn't place it. Emily lingered by the counter, glancing between us, tension in her shoulders, her hands fidgeting. I didn't speak immediately. I only folded the letter slowly, letting its weight and significance fill the room like a quiet, unspoken declaration. The letter wasn't just paper. It was validation, a confirmation that my patience, my careful planning, and my quiet strength had produced real results. No shouting, no confrontation, just the steady accumulation of awareness, strategy, and calm perseverance. I realized that the moments I had spent reclaiming my garden, my home, and my sense of self were building toward this. A quiet, undeniable triumph that didn't need anyone else's acknowledgement to exist. Later that day, I placed the envelope in a small drawer in the study, next to the manila folder I had found weeks earlier. Both represented milestones in my subtle, deliberate reclamation of my life. I smiled faintly, sensing the quiet power growing within me, unshakable and serene. Mark and Emily remained unaware of just how far the shift had gone, and I let it stay that way. Some victories, I realized, are sweetest when they remain unseen until the moment they quietly, inevitably reveal themselves. And in that quiet, calm kitchen, I felt it, the slow, steady pulse of control, of clarity, of life finally aligning with the dignity I had always deserved. The revelation came unexpectedly, in the stillness of a late afternoon. I had been rearranging a few things in the study, shifting papers and photos that had long been gathering dust, when I noticed a small envelope tucked behind a row of books I hadn't touched in years. Its edges were slightly worn, and my name was written in the same careful, deliberate hand as the previous letter. I paused, my heart fluttering in that peculiar mix of curiosity and apprehension. Something told me this wasn't just another routine notice. I opened it slowly, my fingers brushing the paper as if it held secrets that needed gentleness. Inside was a note, brief but weighty. All that you've endured, all that you've quietly reclaimed, it has not gone unnoticed. The house, the accounts, your rightful authority, it is yours. Walk with confidence, for those who doubted will now see the truth. My breath caught. It wasn't just legal validation anymore. It was recognition, an acknowledgement of the years of quiet strength I had cultivated. I sank into my chair, letting the letter rest in my hands, feeling the weight of it anchor me. Mark's laughter, Emily's hesitations, the bruises on my arm, they all seemed to shrink in comparison to this subtle, undeniable vindication. I realized that the power I had gained wasn't something external. It had always been inside me. The papers, the letters, the law, they were only tools to reflect what I had quietly nurtured. My clarity, my patience, my unwavering commitment to dignity. Mark entered the room a few moments later, unaware of the significance of my discovery. His expression, sharp and questioning, faltered when he noticed the calm in my eyes, the unspoken shift in the atmosphere. He tried a joke, something meant to diminish, to reclaim the narrative, but I didn't respond. I let the silence speak. Emily hovered nearby, sensing the subtle tension, unsure of how to intervene. I only smiled faintly, a quiet, knowing smile that carried the weight of everything I had endured and everything I had reclaimed. For hours after, I walked through the house, noticing the details I had ignored, the scratches on the dining table, the little imperfections in the porch, the way sunlight fell across the living room floor. Everything belonged to me. Every inch of this space, every decision, every small act of care was mine to govern. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the fullness of that power. Calm, steady, undeniable. The revelation was not loud. There were no confrontations, no dramatic gestures. It came quietly, in the form of acknowledgement, in the subtle realignment of authority, in the gentle confirmation that what was rightfully mine could never be taken away again. And as I placed the letter next to the other documents, I felt a deep, satisfying peace settle over me. For the first time in months, the house felt like home again, truly mine. And finally, fully respected, that morning, I woke early as I always did, and walked through the house with a sense of calm that had been absent for far too long. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the faint sweetness of the garden herbs that I had tended myself. I moved slowly, deliberately, my casted arm now almost healed, tracing the edges of the furniture, feeling the textures of things I had once taken for granted. Each step, each touch, reminded me that this home, every corner, every shadow, every ray of sunlight, belonged entirely to me. Mark and Emily were downstairs, going through their routine, unaware of the subtle shifts that had been quietly set into motion. I didn't rush, didn't confront. I let the silence carry its own message. The documents, the letters, the careful steps I had taken over weeks and months had done their work. The balance had shifted, not with noise, not with shouting, but with patience, clarity, and unwavering presence. I had reclaimed my life, my peace, my dignity. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the dining room. The empty chair at the head of the table, once a symbol of absence or defiance, now felt like a testament to quiet power. I sat there, feeling the weight of my breath, the pulse in my veins, the calm certainty of ownership that no one could challenge. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves gently along Charleston streets, and the world continued unaware of the small, deliberate victory that had been achieved within these walls. Emily approached quietly, hesitating, then placed a small plate of fruit beside me. Her eyes held gratitude and a trace of awe. I nodded gently, letting her presence be acknowledged without words. Mark, meanwhile, remained distant, silent, the smugness drained from his posture. He had learned in the quietest, most inescapable way that control is not taken through arrogance, but respected when demonstrated through consistency, patience, and integrity. As I sipped my tea, I thought of Nancy, of Deputy Reed, of Tom Riley, the quiet allies who had reminded me that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes slowly, deliberately, and the world adjusts in recognition of its presence. I felt a gentle warmth rise in my chest, a blend of satisfaction, peace, and quiet triumph. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine and letting the natural course of truth and patience do the rest. I glanced around the house one last time before stepping toward the window, looking at the small garden below, the streets stretching through Charleston, the ordinary yet beautiful life I had fought to protect. The weight of fear and doubt that had once held me down was gone. I breathed deeply, allowing the serenity to fill me completely, and whispered softly to myself, "This is my life, my peace, my home. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes silence teaches more than words." Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Maybe your voice will be next on Her Voice.